Welcome to this Baptist News Global webinar. Here's your host, Mark Wingfield.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Wingfield. I am the Executive Director and Publisher of Baptist News Global, and you do not normally see me wearing a suit and tie, but I've just come from officiating a wedding, so that's why I'm dressed like this. It was a lovely outdoor wedding, and everything went well, and they are hitched. I even remembered to sign the wedding license this time and not walk off, which seems to matter to them at least. So we are in a coffee shop in Uptown Dallas. Was a place that we could meet this afternoon, and I'll give a plug to Union Coffee here. That's a ministry of Oak Lawn United Methodist Church, and they've let us use one of their meeting rooms here. And so there's some ambient noise from the other people outside, but it's a great place. If you're in Uptown Dallas ever and looking for great coffee, come by here. It's a great church and a great place to be together. We're so pleased to have with us today for this webinar Dr. Greg Garrett, who many of you know is one of our columnists at B&G and is a professor at Baylor University, a beloved professor, I would add, at Baylor. And our special guest with him, who he's brought along on the U.S. tour, is Reddie, Dr. Anthony Reddie of Oxford University. And hopefully, if you're paying attention in B&G, you read a story about him last week and his new appointment there. So we're going to begin just with a little bit of introductions, and I'm going to ask each of them to say a bit more about who they are and why that matters for what we're talking about today. So, Greg, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'd be pleased to. And hello to everybody who is watching us live, and hello to everybody watching us later. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Greg Garrett. As Mark pointed out, I am a senior columnist for Baptist News, and it's a great pleasure to be able to sort of think through some things that may turn into larger pieces later on. It's one of the things that I enjoy about writing for Baptist News. I hold the Carol McDaniel Hanks Professorship of Literature and Culture at Baylor, and in the church world, I'm the canon theologian for the American Cathedral of the Holy Trinity in Paris, France. And I write, I teach, I love my family, and as often as I can, I get up to Dallas to work with my friends at Wilshire Baptist Church.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Reddie?
Yes, well, my name is Anthony Reddie. I was born in Bradford, West Yorkshire. I said to a few people that Yorkshire is the Texas of the UK. We're the largest county. We feel ourselves to be superior to everyone else. We even have sort of tried to become independent from the rest of Britain at various points. It has not worked, but so we've got a very specific identity. So yes, I come from Yorkshire, although having said that, I've not lived there for almost 40 years. I live in Birmingham in the West Midlands, but I work in Oxford University, where I have two roles. I'm recently appointed the first professor of black theology in Oxford University's 900-year history. And then in addition to that, I'm the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture that's based at Regent's Park College, which is the only Baptist college in the whole of Oxford, and indeed Cambridge as well. I'm proud that my parents come from the Caribbean. They were part of the wave of Caribbean migrants who left the Caribbean to come to rebuild the so-called mother country of Britain post-World War II. I'm the eldest of four children, and I'm passionate about black liberation theology and justice and anti-racism, and I write books and teach classes, and at the moment I'm here on this tour of Texas.
Well, Greg and I don't come from as interesting a place as you, but we actually grew up on opposite sides of Oklahoma City at the very same time. We're approximately the same age, and he was on one side of suburban Oklahoma City, I was on the other side of suburban Oklahoma City, and all these years later we find that out. So here we are. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, and we certainly welcome you to Texas and to Baptist News Global, indeed. So one of the big thing we're going to talk about today is each of these scholars work with two other really important people, James Cone and James Baldwin. And these are two names that get thrown around a lot today, both for good and for ill. It seems like everybody's quoting these two folks. again, to make a point one way or the other. And they're either the source of all inspiration or the source of all evil, depending on your perspective. So I thought we just would begin by assuming you, dear reader or viewer, don't know anything about these two characters, and let's just bring everyone up to speed. And so let's start by talking about James Cone, if we could, and tell us about this person and why he matters.
Right, so James Cone is my hero. He was born in Arkansas in 1938, born into a Methodist family, so he was part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church. And he's rightly credited as being the inventor or the initiator of the academic version of black theology. Now, I say that because he would have always said quite rightly that he did not invent black theology, that black theology was invented the moment the first enslaved person stood up to white supremacy and said that their version of Christianity was wrong. It was an abomination. It wasn't of Christ. If anything, his argument was that the white Christ was the Antichrist. So you can see why a lot of people did not like his arguments. But his assertion was that America's original sin was white supremacy. And the way in which that had impacted on the nation as a whole, but in particular had distorted the very nature of Christianity. So his argument was that right at the heart of Christianity we have a dispossessed, marginalized, oppressed figure called Jesus Christ. He was born in Nazareth, was born in a very humble background, and is in the midst of Roman Empire as an oppressed Palestinian Jew. And yet somehow across the course of some 1500 years, that oppressive, a figure who's oppressed and identifies with other oppressed people now suddenly becomes a symbol for white supremacy. And so Cone's central argument was to argue that if we want to understand the true nature of Christianity, one has to bypass the distortions of white supremacist thinking and entitlement and go back to the core identity of God. So God elects Israel, this small group of people, which is not modern day Israel, but obviously this group of people in the scriptures who are a small group of people, and God identifies with them because they are small, because they are marginalized, and because they are at the behest of empires such as Babylon and various other major powers like Persia and various other people will oppress them. And because God identifies with them, and so one of the things he points to in the scriptures is the story of Moses, and how Moses becomes this liberation leader who leads his people enslaved in Egypt out of slavery into the promised land. That same God who's on the side of those who are marginalized and oppressed is the same God who's on the side of people who are marginalized and oppressed in America. And for Cone, that primarily means, but not only that, but primarily means people who are the descendants of enslaved Africans. That's African Americans. And so Cone identifies black theology as part of and faithful to the liberating tradition that comes out of the scriptures, that comes out of a God who identifies with the oppressed, and particularly finds expression in Jesus himself, who sides with those oppressed people to the point whereby he is then executed, not by the Jews, but executed by the Romans, that are analogous to that form of oppressive power. So Cone sees Rome as very analogous with modern day America in terms of being this imperial power that is focused on subjugating and oppressing people in order to assert its own sense of power and I guess hegemony over others. And so Cone begins to write this down. So his first book is 1969 called Black Theology and Black Power, followed in 1970 by his second book, A Black Theology of Liberation. And then over the next 50 years, he just consistently works at this idea, trying to deepen it, to deepen the intellectual veracity of it, to constantly ask critical questions on mainstream white Christianity, both in terms of the church and the academy, about the ways in which they continue to ignore the true liberationist aspects of Christianity and instead So for Cohen, he would argue that rather than worshipping the God who is on the side of the oppressed, that essentially what white Christianity has done is to focus on their own sense of entitlement and supremacy and turn God into an idol of whiteness.
Yeah.
And so perhaps his last great book is called The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
Yes.
And in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Cohen looks at the cross of the first century in terms of in terms of the instrument of torture which Jesus is crucified, and makes the links between that and the lynching tree of African Americans during the era of Jim Crow, and says actually they're both very similar because they're not about killing people. Cohen says, in the first century, people who are oppressors know how to kill people efficiently. So a spear to the heart would do just as well as a bullet to the brain.
Yeah.
If you still want to kill people, you can do that very quickly. But actually what both crucifixion and lynching do, it's an act of terror.
Yeah.
So in both cases, it takes you hours to die,
Right.
and you do that in order to send a signal to a community you want to subjugate. So if you want to subjugate an oppressive community, you
Right.
say, okay, so just in case any of you get any silly ideas about trying to resist our power, this is what happens to you. And so in the case of crucifixion, it probably take about 3 days to die. And in most cases, you probably died of suffocation. So eventually, your lungs would collapse in on themselves, and you'd die in excruciating agony. That's the point. The point where you die in excruciating agony, it then says to everyone else in that community, this is what happens when you try to defy us. And so Cohen says, therefore, if you understand the links then between the cross and the lynching tree, then Jesus' crucifixion is how oppressed black bodies die when they're being lynched. And therefore, it says that then is another way of seeing that God is not revealed in the midst of white supremacy and white power. The way in which to see God and be in solidarity with God and to be righteous alongside God's sense of justice is to be alongside those who are oppressed. So to be on the side of oppressed black bodies and to fight white supremacy.
So just to be clear, he begins his writing situated in the heart of the civil rights movement in the United States, 1965.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. That's an important.
Yeah.
Thank you. Beautiful. Now, the other James Baldwin.
Well, James Baldwin is an American writer, critic, essayist, and activist. He was born in 1924 in Harlem. Next year is the 100th anniversary of his birth. He is a major figure in American literature and in American history. But toward the end of his life, he suffered something of a critical decline in the way that people thought about his writing. And there were other sort of more strident and militaristic black activists who did not like the fact that he still was looking at love and reconciliation as a way of bringing some sort of conclusion, if there is to be a conclusion, to the problem of race in America. So Baldwin was 60 years ago one of the best known figures in America. In 1963, his book, The Fire Next Time, was the #1 book on the New York Times bestseller list. Yeah. It spent 41 weeks on the bestseller lists. He went on a speaking tour of the American South that was covered by national media, including a feature in Life magazine. And in 1963, Robert F. Kennedy, who at that time was the Attorney General for his brother John Kennedy, invited James Baldwin to pull together a group of civil rights leaders to meet with him so that essentially he could talk about what good things the Kennedy administration was doing for them. It was a meeting that did not go well. Everybody walked out of there angry at everybody else. But one of the things, and I've actually written about this for Baptist News in the last year or two, is that while that meeting went disastrously and Robert Kennedy reacted with the sort of white fragility that we kind of come to expect when people are confronted with their possible racism or complicity with racism, he walked out of there angry because he was trying to explain to them that change was only possible incrementally. And he was thinking about that politically. It's like, these are the political resources we have. These are the lines of credit we can draw on, so to speak. And what Baldwin and the other activists that were there at that meeting had said to them is that it's not a political issue, it's a moral issue. It's an absolute issue. And so the question is not what is possible given the makeup of the House or the Senate. The question is, how are we going to get to this place of absolute moral clarity that this is wrong? And so Kennedy walked out of there. He was angry. Everybody was so upset. There's actually footage of James Baldwin, who went on television that night, directly after leaving that meeting with Kennedy. And he was so angry and upset and near tears. I mean, you can see it across these years, how disastrously that meeting went. But one of the things that I think is really important about that meeting and the importance of difficult conversations, as I wrote about it for Baptist News, is that a few months later, Robert Kennedy had changed his mind. Like, he had begun to see that, as uncomfortable as that meeting had made him feel, that Baldwin and those other folks in the room were right. And he went to his brother and he said, we need to do a national primetime address on race. And he drafted much of that speech for John Kennedy. And if you listen to it, which you can do on YouTube, you will discover him talking about racism as a moral issue. So the things that Baldwin had wanted to get across eventually got across. And that is sort of the hope that I have for him in the longer sense. Because many of the things that Baldwin wrote about, we are dealing with right now. 5 or 6 years ago, I would have said we were in a very different space racially in this country than we are now. And Baldwin wrote in the 1950s and 1960s about white supremacists. He wrote about violent rhetoric in No Name in the Street, which is my favorite Baldwin book. He talks about how these senators and politicians in the American South, how their violent rhetoric had endangered black people, how black people were being killed and maimed because of it. And he said that is what that rhetoric was intended to do. Yeah. And so even now at this moment, when we're thinking about powerful people and their hateful rhetoric and what harm can be engendered by it, we are living in this age in which Baldwin speaks back to us. And while I would love for us not to need him, like I would love for us not to need James Cone in this vital way, both of these Jameses are speaking back into 2023 in ways that are important and necessary, and also, in fact, it's shameful for us to admit that after all of this wisdom was laid out in front of us, we still haven't progressed further.
Just a quick, do you know what month in '63 that Kennedy address was?
Ooh, off the top of my head, I do not.
But it obviously had to be very near his assassination.
It was before that.
Because, we're coming up on the 60th anniversary this month.
That's right.
In 2 weeks.
So I just, off the top of my head, I'm going to say May.
Okay.
And I think that conversation may have been in February or March.
Yeah.
I wrote a book about it, and it's in the book.
Okay.
So it's like I tell my students, what does the syllabus say? Go. What did I say when I wrote it down?
So did Cone and Baldwin know each other and interact with each other?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I did. Yeah. So when Cone was coming up in the late 60s, Baldwin would have been at its peak. And I believe that what linked them also was their admiration and friendship with Martin Luther, with Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yes.
And so Cone's admiration for Baldwin was really both him being this fierce possessor to speak the truth. I think he would be one of Cone's, as heroes and maybe mentors in that regard, in terms of speaking truth to power.
Yes.
In terms of being willing to be disliked and being willing to be annoying to others, but always wanting to tell the truth. So that is part of the connection. But also, I think what Cone says is that he loves Baldwin's style. So Baldwin is a stylist in terms of his prose.
Yeah.
And obviously this is much more Greg's area than mine, but when you read Baldwin, he's always readable. You know, I mean, you read it and the words have such poetic grace that they just make you want to keep on turning the page. And Cohn says that when he then began to write his first book, he knew that the kind of book he wanted to write was to capture something of the cadence and something of the, I guess, sort of jazz-informed way in which Baldwin writes. So I'm not sure Baldwin ever says this in his work formally, but there's something of the kind of improvisation of African American jazz at its best that just has this way of weaving ideas that kind of come and go, that float around, that coalesce in a moment, and then take off to something else.
Yeah.
And so Cohn says that he wants to write in a way that captures the true essence of lyrical genius of Baldwin.
Oh, wow, that's great. That's really beautiful. Beautiful. Great. Anything to add to that?
Well, I would just say that my book about James Baldwin was published by Orbis, the great Catholic publisher of liberation theology, James Cohn's publisher. And my editor and publisher told me that he had tried to talk Cohn into writing a book about Baldwin. And there is a chapter or two late in Cohn's life where he's writing about Baldwin. And I would love to have read that book, but it also makes me feel like maybe I would not have needed or wanted to write my book if James Cohn had his chance to do that.
That's great. So both of these figures in our modern situation are both quoted and revered and reviled, as I mentioned earlier. I think Cohn maybe more than Baldwin. So much of the, let's call it the backlash in the United States on critical race theory and book bans and all these scary things has to do, I mean, his name shows up everywhere in this. Why is he such a boogeyman?
Well, I think the fundamental truth is that Cohn is a prophet. And we have, I think certainly within our Christian informed nations, and I would say this about the UK and the US, that we have a certain rhetoric that says that we admire prophets and we like truth telling. No, we don't. We do not like prophets. And
it's not a good definition.
Jesus said something about that.
We certainly don't like prophets. And I suspect that it might be the case, maybe in 20, 30 years' time, once Cohn's long gone. And therefore, because he's gone and his memory then becomes sealed into a kind of mythology, that what might happen to him, maybe, is what has happened to Martin Luther King Jr.
Right.
So now, of course, you see, King is now got to a point where he's been mythologized for 50
Right,
60.
he's been sanitized, too.
Exactly, yes. It is, so nearly everyone now loves King. You know?
Right.
I can't think of anyone who would dislike him because he's long gone and we can turn his memory into what we want.
Yes.
But actually, if you go back in history at the time, King was very contentious.
Yes.
And certainly most black churches were not in favor of him, for example, talking about the military-industrial complex and talking about the stupidity and the immorality of the Vietnam War.
Right.
He was not loved in his time. And I think that's the same with Cohn. I think the reason why we don't like prophets is that prophets tell us the uncomfortable truth of things that we do not want to hear in the present. But here's the thing, of course, all of us know that the past is always 20/20 vision.
Right.
So it's always easy to look back and say, well, of course, like we now agree that obviously segregation was wrong. Of course we know that Jim Crow was terrible. But here's the thing, lots of people didn't think that at the time.
Right.
And King's genius was to tell people uncomfortable truths in the moment, not wait for posterity, but to say it in the moment. And that's what Cohn has been doing. Cohn has been calling out white supremacy for the best part of 50 years and saying, actually, what most white churches do on a Sunday morning has nothing at all to do with Jesus of Nazareth, have nothing at all to do with the biblical tradition of justice and prophecy and righteousness in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian New Testament. And basically it is an abomination and it's blasphemy. Well, obviously when you are telling white people that essentially they are liars and hypocrites, that's not going to win you any friends, let's be perfectly honest.
Right.
That's not going to win you friends. But I think that's the courage, is to say in the moment, and to say in the hope that you'll be vindicated in the future. But that does not guarantee that that's the case. But you say it anyway, not because you want popularity, you say it because it's the truth.
Again, it reminds me of Jesus, who called out liars and hypocrites, for sure. Well, so now Baldwin, we don't hear as reviled today. Why is that?
Well, I do want to talk about that, but let me follow up on Anthony's thing, because there's something that I was thinking about in connection with that. I've done a bunch of archival work at the LBJ Library in Austin, where I live, and there are huge files on Martin Luther King. And in 1968, LBJ was receiving multiple telegrams, phone calls, letters daily about the March on Washington that King was planning.
Yes.
And I mean, I live in 2023, and I know what hatred and revilement looks like. But these were angry people who were calling King the most dangerous man in America, that he needed to be stopped, however that needed to happen. And so I just want to sort of call that attention to it, because, you know, as you were both saying, the King that we have now is somebody sort of equally quoted by people on all sides of, you know, the various divides. Whether or not King would actually have been in any kind of communion with them and their thinking. So the Baldwin thing is really interesting. I've been doing a ton of radio and media stuff, a bunch of podcast stuff, and often what happens is somebody reads the book and they will say to me on air, "How come I've never heard of James Baldwin before?" This is clearly a major person.
Right.
And I have been thinking about this, and this is purely theory. But one of the things that I've been saying in response to that is, unlike Medgar Evers or Malcolm X or Dr. King, Baldwin lived.
Oh.
Baldwin was not martyred to the movement.
Right.
And he lived to the point, you know, so had King lived, he could have lived into irrelevance. Yeah. You know, I can't imagine a world in which that would be possible, but it could have happened.
Right.
You know, and Baldwin lived past his sort of critical, you know, sell-by date. His later novels are not as well known. Some of the last nonfiction writing that he did doesn't rank with The Fire Next Time, which was that 1963 book. And so he is sort of this sidelined lion, you know. So, you know, if we can sort of, I guess, take that metaphor, he's like, he's the old lion who's just sort of sitting, you know, in the sunlight, you know, in the zoo, and so we don't pay attention to him in the same way that we do, you know, those lions that are roaring and clawing at the bars. Right. Although for many years that's who he was and what he did. And I think the other thing is, you know, Anthony was talking about the incredible gift that Baldwin had as a literary artist. As we become less and less interested in literature, and as, you know, we develop generations of people who don't read as intensely, you know, we are much more interested in a sound bite or 288 characters. Even though Baldwin is incredibly accessible and very readable, just your chance of running across him accidentally is not great. Right. You know, so when I teach Baldwin, my students often have never heard of him before. Right.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. I'm going to take a pause here and say to those who are online live, if you have a question, you'd like to use the Q&A function and load up some questions in there, and we'll get to those toward the end of the webinar here. And if you joined us in progress and didn't hear my pitch, we are coming to you live from Union Coffee Shop in Uptown Dallas, and if you hear chatter in the background, it's all the happy people jacked up on coffee over there for a good cause, nonetheless. So we're grateful to be here. All right, this is just a fascinating background to help level our understanding of this. Clearly, both of these authors have lessons we need to pay attention to today, because you both said that their writings, their teaching, their influence is enduring, and which is why they're threatening as well. Let's talk about what would some of those be? What are the lessons that Greg, you said we hadn't learned all these years later, right?
Well, I mean, here in 2023, we are broadcasting from Dallas. And not far from here in Austin, where I live, the state legislature has come up with a number of measures, talking about how history can be taught in schools. And as I was pointing out to Anthony when we were in San Antonio last week on an earlier leg of his world tour, how docents at the Alamo can talk about the slaveholding past of the heroes of the Alamo.
Right.
So there is in Texas, in a number of other southern states, in the book banning activities across the country, there is this attempt to erase or neutralize history, particularly when, as is the wording, as you know, in many of these bills, it makes students uncomfortable.
Right.
And from a pedagogical point of view, I can tell you that discomfort is one of the ways that we are drawn to learn.
Right.
So that is the painfully tragic piece there. But Baldwin's insistence throughout his life is on the importance of history, on the necessity to reckon with American history, and how both whites and blacks are trapped in this same, dance of death until we can reckon with and for people, Mark, who look like us, repent of and begin to repair that history. And Baldwin said these things with compassion and with love. One of the things that I think makes him a central figure is that even when he was very angry, he saw the deep humanity in people across the divide from him. I'm wondering if maybe part of that was his training as a novelist, to look at all of his characters and see their brokenness. But that's one of the things that I think makes him particularly pertinent today, is his insistence on our telling the truth. And in all of the racial reconciliation work that I do, that's the first and most necessary step. You can't do anything else, and Baldwin writes this over and over, until you tell the truth about your situation, about the past and the present, where it leaves us.
Yeah. That's so brilliant. So, what are the big lessons we need to carry forward from Cone?
Well, I would say two things really. More generically, Cone always reminds us that we should be on the side of the underdog. We should be on the side of those who are marginalized. We should be on the side of those who are scapegoated. So anyone who is scapegoated, anyone who we are told our problem is their fault, and it's usually people without power, are the people that we should be aligned to and supporting and upholding. Because Cone was always aware of the way in which scapegoating is deeply etched into many of our societies. There's a great quote that comes from one of my friends and colleague. That's a guy called Miguel de la Torre, who was a social ethicist at Ireland School of Theology, and he says, in many of our societies, we praise upwards and blame downwards. And Cone would have been one of those who would have said, even before Miguel had said that, in a different way, that we have to be on the side of those who are blamed and those who are seen as scapegoats. You know, I mean, why is it, certainly, both in your context and my context, that we have the language of the undeserved poor? That somehow if people are poor, it's their fault, they haven't tried hard, and therefore like they need to be punished for being poor. But we don't have the language of the undeserved rich. But why is that? And so Cone's thing would be, we have to be attentive to the way in which the media will construct us in our directions in such way to blame people who are often actually like they're the ones who have not created the problems, they're the ones who are the ones who suffer the most from our present system. Right. But first and foremost, I think Cone's greatest gift, and one of the things I loved about him was that I think how we age as people is always interesting, and sometimes when we get into old age, we can sort of betray our younger selves because that you get old, and certainly there was many a person of letters and ideas who were wonderfully radical when they were young and then became very reactionary. and very intolerant in old age. Cohn never lost his prophetic fire. So even when he wrote, I think it's one of his great books, which cost him The Lynching Tree, he was in his late 60s, early 70s when he wrote that. And the book is as fiery and as unrepentantly on the side of the oppressed and the marginalised as his books he was writing 40 years earlier. And I think Cohn's greatest gift is to call out white supremacy. It's to point to whiteness and say, this thing that often works so surreptitiously, in a way that like we almost don't see it because it becomes normal.
Right.
Even our language becomes problematic. So when people say to me, well, you know, aren't you like you're a person of colour? So white people then don't have colour either. But you know, so even
we're colour neutral.
Exactly, that's the point. That's the point. It's,
right.
It's neutral. It's a point of departure. It's the norm, and everything else gets defined against it. And Cohn was the first one to say to white people that essentially you need to reckon with whiteness. You need to deconstruct it so that rather than it becoming a system and a symbol of oppression, it can become a symbol and I guess a way of being that sits alongside other perspectives, rather than being one that has to predominate and then judge other people. And so Cohn, his fierceness in calling out white supremacy and reminding white people that actually, like, there's no curse in being white, it's what you do with being white.
Yes.
It's how you then live with the privileges of that. And one of his heroes was a German theologian called Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
And as many of your viewers will know, that Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for his convictions in terms of supporting Jewish oppressed people in Nazi Germany and standing up to Adolf Hitler and his murderous regime. And Cohn says, well, actually, that is the way in which a responsible form of whiteness can operate, to be in solidarity with those who are marginalized. Bonhoeffer wasn't Jewish.
Right.
He could have stayed in America. He was here in Union Theological Seminary in New York when the war broke, but yet he went back in order to fight alongside other people, recognizing the privilege he had and the opportunities he had to be alongside those who are on the margins. And Cohn says he operates as a great example for what he wants white Americans to be until they speak out against white supremacy, until they speak out against systemic racism, and until they're on the side of those who are marginalized and oppressed and those who are seen as scapegoats, then essentially they are fooling and deluding themselves to think that God is on their side. They may feel that they can get away with it now, and they may get away with it tomorrow, but they won't get away with it forever.
This idea of the white neutrality and center point, I have the same problem with people who claim to be centrists, as if the center is the natural place to be, that's God's divine favor. Right. But now, here's a difficult question. You know, we're talking about God being on the side of the oppressed and the marginalized. We have this huge example going on in the world today where you have one marginalized people group, Israel, oppressing another marginalized people group. And it's so difficult because if you criticize one, you're anti-Semitic, you appear to be, or you're Islamophobic, and here are two oppressed non-minority groups who are engaged in this. How in the world do we make sense of that, and what would Cohn say about that?
Okay, now this may sound controversial to some, but I will say anyway. Actually, it's not difficult. Yes, I have no doubt that Jewish people have suffered anti-Semitism and still do and are oppressed. I accept that. And the attack on Israel by Hamas was atrocious and terrible, and Israel has a right to defend itself. But let's be clear, Israel has the third biggest army in the world. The Jewish people may be oppressed, but the state of Israel is a powerful state itself. It has a bigger army than my own country in Britain does.
Right.
Therefore, when you talk about a war, it's a war between two unequal entities. So firstly, to be clear, that Hamas are terrible, but not all Palestinians are Hamas supporters, and therefore, this a sense of what effectively is retaliation. Whilst I understand it as a natural reaction to the hurt of being attacked, and I get that. Firstly, it is, according to UN law, illegal.
Right.
Actually, collective punishment is illegal. And certainly in my own country, when we had the IRA bombing Britain, mainland Britain,
Yes.
what our British governments did not do is to go into Northern Ireland and then attack every
And bomb all of
single
Northern Ireland.
and bomb the whole of Northern Ireland
Right.
because a minority group were terrorists. Hamas are terrorists, but like the whole of Gaza isn't, or the whole of Gaza should not pay for one particular group of people who are
Yes.
not representative of all of them. That's the first thing. But secondly is, yes, indeed, yes, Jewish people are a oppressed minority, but the state of Israel is effectively, in military terms, a superpower.
Yes. Yeah, well said. I love that comparison to Northern Ireland. Yeah, that's really interesting. Let me check real quick and see if we have any thing in the Q&A before I keep chattering here. Okay, we don't yet. If you have questions you want to pop in, please do, and we'll get back to those in just a moment. In the little bit of time that we have left, let's focus on maybe what you're learning on this U.S. tour that you've been on these 2 weeks. What have you seen that's been interesting? What have you heard that's been interesting? Have any of your ideas changed or challenged along the way?
Okay, so what I think I've been reminded of, and I kind of knew it anyway theoretically, but I've seen it in lived experience, is the danger of not believing the hype about particular places or spaces. So when I told friends that I'd been invited here by my friend Greg, and I was doing this tour of Texas, that's one of my friends who shall remain not named, said, oh man, so like you got the yeehaw. And I said, okay. And I said, because in his mind, Texas had a certain perception. Now, obviously, some of that may be true.
Right, some of it.
But here's the thing, I have met some wonderful people in my time here. People who are compassionate, who are radical, who are progressive, who want to believe in justice. Now, admittedly, that's thanks to my friend, so he's introduced me to all of the right people.
Right.
But actually, that's been brilliant, because what that's reminding me of is that there's always a danger of making these blanket assertions and assumptions about any particular place. And just as I want people to be nuanced about me being black, so if I turn up as a black person, I don't want you to make assumptions of me because you've read the newspaper and the assumption is that black people are like this, because well, actually some of us might be, but most of us are not.
Right.
Well, actually, that's a reminder that actually not all Texans are the same either. So to say very clearly, I have met people who I hopefully will be in contact with for the rest of my life, because they have a lot to teach me. Hopefully I've shared some good things with them, but it's been a really amazing opportunity to meet and just to see actually like the diversity of Texas.
Yes.
So I think that's really been the main thing. I guess in a much more trivial sense, man, Texas is big.
Yes, and you've only seen part of it.
But I come from a place whereby, like a 3-hour drive is like a long drive.
Right.
Here it's like, I'm popping down the road and it's 3 hours, so, it's
if we just had your trains, we would be much better off.
Right, indeed.
Absolutely. So, Greg, what's the inverse of that for you as you've been with Anthony for these days? What have you learned from him and from these conversations? How's it changed you?
Well, one part of it is purely personal. Anthony and I have been friends for years now, and we have worked together on projects, and I knew we had a number of shared interests. But I was telling my wife Jeannie a couple of nights ago that one of the things that I'm sort of constantly surprised by is how similar we are. And when I wrote about James Baldwin, I was like, the initial part of my book is, in terms of our Venn diagrams, it doesn't look like there should be a whole lot of intersection. But Anthony and I are very similar in a lot of ways, in terms of personality and family history, and in terms of the things that we want to accomplish and how we want to use our knowledge and our gifts in the world. And so one of the things that's just been really lovely is to drive around the vast state of Texas with Anthony and to have that opportunity. But the other thing that is really, really interesting is I am loving seeing him do black theology in a variety of settings. And one of the things that I know about Anthony and that your viewers are also seeing is that there's a gentleness about him and a sense of humor about him. And I too am a huge fan of James Cone, but Anthony will remember that I had a student who came into my office almost in tears. She was supposed to present on James Cone, and she plopped down in the chair opposite from me and she said, "James Cone is so angry at me." and we have a mutual friend whose name I will not mention because that friend does not need to be brought into this comparison. Right. But sometimes people's affect and their the way they present themselves can be a bar to the teaching and the learning that might happen. And one of the things that I've noticed is in all of these settings with pastors, with people in the black church, people in the white church, with students, that Anthony is able to do this teaching with passion, but also in a way that people hear it. And they are not sitting there in tears going, "Anthony Reddie is so angry at me." And so that's been a really lovely thing, because it would be a shame if people were prevented from learning great lessons for superficial reasons. And what I think that Anthony does is he takes the teaching of Dr. Cone. He's developed his own thinking about black theology, and every room that he walks into, he walks in with this passion, but he also walks in with generosity. I want you all to hear this, and I believe if you do hear it, it could be life-changing. And that was my whole hope when I invited him to come and spend time with us and to come and visit churches, including Wilshire Baptist tomorrow. Yeah. That they would have that experience that I have had over the years as I've known Anthony.
So the irony of this conversation is I'm sitting here looking through glass wall here into this coffee shop where we are, and as over the past hours we've been here, it is almost a central casting diversity set of people in here. It is as mixed a group of people as I think you could possibly assemble. White, brown, I mean just everybody that's been through here. And that certainly represents an ideal we couldn't have imagined 60 years ago in the United States, right? And yet, one of the things we find in the U.S. is a lot of our pastors are preaching in churches where they cannot address these issues. They feel they can't.
Right.
And I'm wondering, is it the same in the UK?
Yes, it is. It's changed, I think, post George Floyd, post the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter has opened up more spaces for conversations. But certainly I would say that talk about race is still difficult.
Right.
And what tends to happen is that that in the UK, I call it whataboutery. So what tends to happen is that, like, you raise the issue of race and then someone says, "Oh yeah, but like, what about?" And then you say, "Okay."
Right.
And at which point you realise that people at that point are willing to talk about anything except race. So all of a sudden, okay, let's talk about class and patriarchy. Let's talk about sexuality and eco-justice. And it's like, well, all those are issues. But it's interesting that, like, you weren't interested in talking about them until I turned up to talk about race. And now, and so what I tried to do is to say, okay, let's talk about those things, because actually there's a dimension of race in all of them.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
yes.
actually, so therefore, like, we're talking about eco-justice, and let's talk about where are the people suffering the most then with environmental change.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, it has to be the poorest people of
That's
color.
right.
So, okay, if we're talking about gender, okay, let's talk about gender, let's talk about patriarchy and sexism. How many black women are in the room around this conversation when white women are asking me that question about gender? So actually, that's fine.
Yeah.
If you want to do whataboutery, I can do that, but I can still bring race in as well.
Yes.
What I try to encourage people to do is to say, and apologies to Greg, because Greg's heard me say this quite a few times in my talk, but I'll say it again. that justice is not like having a pie with a limited number of pieces.
Yes.
And so if I give you 3 pieces of justice pie and you get 2 or 3 justice, and I'm saying, yeah, but like, where's my justice?
Right.
It's not a zero-sum game.
Right.
Actually, the better analogy for me is that justice is like having a series of boats in a harbour. So when you raise the tide, it raises all the boats.
Right.
Therefore, it's not a zero-sum game. Actually, justice helps all of us.
Yes.
Actually, justice will help people who believe in white supremacy, because for the most part, the people who have been taught to hate the most are the people who are usually the poorest, who actually are suffering from the same system that is oppressing other people of colour.
We've seen that in both our countries.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In our politics. Yes.
Exactly, yes. So actually, what I try to do when talking to white working class people is to say, okay, I understand your anger and your frustration, but you're taking it out on the wrong people.
Right.
Actually, the people who are oppressing you are probably rich white people. So this idea
Right.
that somehow as a white person you've been taught to hate people of colour because they're your enemy. Actually, they're probably as poor as you are, and neither of you create the system that is exploiting you.
Right.
So actually, what I want to try to work with is to develop empathy, to get people to say, actually, our issues are often more alike than unalike. They still come down to issues of power. They come down to issues of whose stories get told, who is able to control the narrative, who's able to control resources to reward some people but punish others. And therefore issues of race or class or gender and sexuality, they're not the same things, I acknowledge that, but they're more alike than unalike.
Yeah, they're interlinked in so many ways.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely, yeah. And therefore, I want to encourage coalition building. I want to see people who are oppressed, who really have more in common than what separates them, to say, actually, why can't we then try to work together? Not saying it will be easy. It's not the equivalent of just holding hands and singing Kumbaya.
Right.
Wish it were that easy, but it's not. It is difficult, but it's not impossible. And I think what Baldwin reminds us of, and I read Greg's book, obviously when it first came out, but I reread it again a couple of days ago in readiness for this. And what I love about Baldwin, as Greg says, even when he's angry and he's at his most frustrated and he's just shaking his head in tears at America and at the world, he still believes that we can be better. He still believes that there is a redemptive turn. Whether it comes out of organised religion, he wouldn't have said it that way, although Cohen probably more was connected to the black church.
Right.
But what they both are saying in their different ways is that we can be better. We're not fatalised to be stuck in one place, continuing to make the same mistakes over and over again. We can be better, but it takes courage. It takes strength to face up to the failures of the past. It takes courage to look in the mirror and recognise ourselves as we are, and not as some mythologized heroic set of people when we're not that. But we can change.
Well, let's end with one little shameless plug, because if people want to read more about what you've been talking about, Greg, your book is fresh out, and give a little plug for it.
The Gospel According to James Baldwin. And as Anthony points out, it is a book that ultimately recognizes how, even as difficult as things were in Baldwin's lifetime, the witness, the heartbreak, that to the end of his life he believed in the possibility of hope. He believed in the concept of the welcome table, the idea that all of us would someday gather around the table where our perceived identities did not matter, where we were all simply children of God. So that book came out in September from Orbis, and I still am getting the chance to talk about it often. And so it's a joy to be able to share a tiny bit of it with our audience today.
Yeah, and I would add, this is, if you're afraid of, this is not an academic book in the sense that it's going to dry. It is a very accessible, narrative-driven book that also I think would be good for small group study and reflection.
I would not say that it wouldn't.
Right, yeah, but that's always a good plug, yeah. And Dr. Reddie, tell us about your book on James Cone.
Yeah, so my book is entitled Introducing James H. Cone. It came out last summer, I think, yeah, last summer.
Yep.
And it's published by SCM Press. And what I try to do in the book is, that's in two parts. So the first half I outline some of the key ideas of Colin's work, and say something about him as a person and what drove him to do his writing.
Yes.
In the second half, I offer a brief summary of what I think are his key texts, and say why you should read them.
Yes.
And so really it's a way of helping people who don't know anything about him as a starter for 10 to read that, and then hopefully to go on and read his other books. I mean, I hope that reading my book will lead people to go read Cohen himself.
Okay.
Right.
Because like the best person who talks about Cohen is Cohen himself.
Right.
But on the other hand, I mean, he wrote over a dozen books, so obviously my book is I hope is a helpful way of sort of bookending his 50-year writing career.
And a lot of us have a lot of catching up to do, for sure. Thank you both for aiding in this conversation today. Thank you to all who've joined us, either live now or on YouTube later, or on Facebook later. And of course, read all about this in Baptist News, baptistnews.com. Thanks so much, and good evening to everyone.
Support independent faith-based journalism. Baptist News Global.